The increase in food banks across the UK is linked to the government's austerity cuts, according to a study published in the British Medical Journal. The study says cuts in spending on local services, welfare benefits and unemployment rates are the leading causes of food bank use. The number of local authorities with food banks operated by the Trussell Trust increased from 29 to 251 in just 5 years. The likelihood of a food bank opening in an area that hasn't experienced a cut in local authority spending is estimated at around 14%. But that's a stark contrast to just over 50% in authorities that had experienced a budget cut of 3%. The Conservatives are promising to respond positively to a Church of England-backed report on the spread of food banks. They say they'll send fresh guidance to 700 job centres. The Labour Party says it'll cut welfare spending while increasing the minimum wage to £8 an hour. They are also promising to create more jobs for the young. And the Liberal Democrats passed the policy motion Food Poverty. It calls for additional funding for food banks to help those in need. RT UK hasn't been able to obtain comment from UKIP at the time of going to air. Well, I'm joined now by Dr Rachel Loopstra, who's a researcher on welfare systems and one of the authors of this report. Dr Loopstra, tell me, how do food banks work? Can you just go to one?
Yeah, so we were specifically focusing on the Trussell Trust food banks, and they work by a referral system. So for someone to be able to receive a food hamper, they have to first receive a referral from a frontline care professional, such as a physician or a social worker. Once they've received that referral, they can then take their voucher to their local food bank and receive a hamper that contains about 3 days' worth of food.
Who then is using food banks, according to your research?
Well, what we looked at is where food banks are being most used across local authorities in the UK. And what we found was that the highest rates of food hamper distribution were happening in places with the highest rates of unemployment and that had experienced the highest rates of spending cuts in welfare benefits, as well as where we saw the most job seekers allowance claimants being sanctioned, which means having their benefits cut off.
The government keeps telling us that the economy is in recovery, yet there are still an estimated 900,000 people using food banks. How can we tally those two things?
Well, I think what we're continuing to see is that there are future cuts being announced, specifically to those that are most vulnerable, so particularly cuts to welfare benefit spending. So I think what we're seeing is that economic recovery is not reaching those in the bottom end of the income distribution, and in fact those are the people that are being hit hardest by austerity measures.
The central question on your research was something that I found really interesting. You asked whether there's a rise in food bank use because there are more food banks or whether it's because there's more need for them. What was the answer?
So this has been a critical debate and something that has been hotly disputed, and what we wanted to do was account for both supply side factors as well as increasing needs. So while we did see that there's higher rates of food bank use in places that have greater food bank access, as indicated by the number of food banks in an area and the number of years a food bank was operating, over and above those supply side factors, we saw that welfare benefit cuts and higher rates of sanctioning and unemployment are linked to higher rates of food bank use. So it certainly seems to be that greater supply is not the answer, or does not explain the rise in food bank use that we're seeing completely.
Is this a comprehensive picture of who is using food banks and why?
That's a really good question, and no, it's not. It's only covering Trussell Trust food banks, and they do make up the largest provision of food banks in the UK, but we didn't collect data from other food banks, and the Trussell Trust is the only organisation that we know of that has consistently tracked their members' food parcel distribution over time. Importantly, however, I think we also need to look at the bigger picture in the population in terms of who is experiencing insecure access to food. Research from other countries has shown that only about 1/4 of people who experience insecure access to food actually go to food banks. So key is to also develop a monitoring system to monitor food insecurity in the UK.
Okay, Dr Rachel Loopstra, thank you very much for talking to us tonight.
Thank you.